The roots of the Russian Revolution go back into the 19th century and before. Now, Russia in 1917 was the largest state on earth, a vast multi-ethnic empire. Radiating from the heartland of Muscovy, inhabited by ethnic Russians, were a variety of peoples conquered from the Middle Ages to the 19th century. To the east lay Siberia, populated by Russians, but also by Kazakhs, Buryats, Tuvinians, and Yakuts. To the south lived Ukrainians, Georgians, and Armenians. To the west were Poles, and to the north were Finns, Estonians, Latvians, and Lithuanians. Now, the Russian Empire was prone to the same ethnic and nationalistic tensions that we've seen in the rest of Europe, especially in the Austro-Hungarian Empire. It faced also the problem of maintaining authority over vast distances. In the 19th century, it did so by harsh repression. In the eyes of contemporary observers, Russia was the most conservative and economically backward of the major European states. Its social structure was that of a traditional ancien regime. The Tsar was ruled autocratically as second only to God. Great aristocrats owned most of the land, and that land was worked for them by the peasants, who formed 80% of the Russian population. Those peasants had been serfs prior to the 1860s, after being granted their freedom in 1866, they remained miserably poor. Now, there was also some small urban elite of factory owners, professionals, and intellectuals. Subordinate to them were urban workers, about 10% of the population, who were poorly paid but mostly literate and increasingly politicized. Now, Russia's economy was overwhelmingly agricultural. Apart from the Ottoman Empire, it was the slowest major European power to industrialize. Russia had been trying to westernize and modernize since at least the time of Peter the Great, but its leaders rejected liberalism and nationalism. Now, following the Decembrist revolt of 1825, Tsar Nicholas I created a state police with tight censorship and strict control of university life. By mid-19th century, the writers and students reacted by forming secret liberal groups urging reform of the Tsarist state. The populists wanted to free the serfs and improve the lot of the peasants. Anarchists opposed the idea of all government. Socialists also wanted revolution, but they split into two groups. The Socialist Revolutionary Party, founded in 1901, concentrated on improving the lot of the peasants, and the Marxists formed the Russian Socialist Democratic Labor Party in 1898 to politicize urban workers. By 1903, socialists had split into two factions. Bolsheviks, from the Russian word for majority, led by Vladimir Ilyich Lenin, favored a more centralized and disciplined party. Mensheviks, from the Russian word for minority, were more loosely organized and included intellectual moderates. In 1905, the Constitutional Democrats, or Cadets, were formed as a moderate liberal party. Now, Alexander II met these groups halfway, easing censorship, freeing the serfs, and creating local representative bodies called Zemstvos. His reward was to be assassinated by anarchists in 1881. His successors, Alexander III and Nicholas II, turned their backs on reform and imposed a series of repressive measures. Nationalist movements were crushed in Poland, the Ukraine, and Finland. Religious minorities were repressed, including Roman Catholics in Poland, Protestants in the Baltic states, and the Jews throughout the empire. The power of the Zemstvos was curtailed. Popular education was discouraged, the press was heavily censored, a secret police informed on the population, political dissidents were imprisoned or driven into exile, and industrialization was encouraged, but working conditions were poor and trade unions were outlawed. Now, the reign of Nicholas II was increasing tension over these measures, as well as several crises of foreign policy. In 1904 to 05, Russia lost an ill-advised war against Japan. Russia's defeat led indirectly to the Revolution of 1905. On Sunday, the 22nd of January, 1905, a peaceful crowd seeking to petition the Tsar for better conditions was fired on. About 100 demonstrators were killed, at the Winter Palace at St. Petersburg. Now, this led to a general strike that forced the government to concede creation of a weak legislature, the Duma, and some civil liberties, including the right of assembly. At this point, workers began to form elective councils, called Soviets, in major cities. But during the period of 1905 to 1914, the government reasserted itself and went back on some of its promises. Workers' organizations and ethnic groups were suppressed, and thousands of revolutionaries were sent to prison or exiled, the later including Vladimir Lenin and Leon Trotsky. In 1914, Nicholas II plunged Russia into World War I, which was popular at first, even among the radical groups. But by 1917, the nation had experienced 7.5 million casualties, and famine threatened the large cities. Now, the October Revolution was precipitated by Russia's misery in World War I. Now, as we've seen, the war was disastrous for Russia. In February 1917, following the breakdown of order in Petrograd, the name of St. Petersburg during 1914-24, Nicholas II abdicated. The new provisional government was a liberal coalition, eventually dominated by Alexander Kerensky. The end of Tsarist repression meant that all sorts of radical groups could come out of the woodwork. The Soviets of workers and soldiers also reactivated. And by the end of February, the Petrograd Soviets had united into one, thus forming an alternative source of power to the government. In the spring of 1917, the Germans, sensing an opportunity, rounded up Lenin and Trotsky and other exiled Russian dissidents and put them on a train for Russia. Lenin immediately began to give a series of fiery speeches for peace and against the provisional government. He was joined by Leon Trotsky, who brought over many Mensheviks. The Bolsheviks also attracted dispirited soldiers, alienated workers, and students. In the countryside, peasants began to form Soviets of their own, in some cases seizing land from their landlords. Suppressed nationalities also grew restive. Now, on all these issues, the Kerensky government was a disappointment. Kerensky wanted to continue the war, he refused land reform, he included industrialists in the cabinet, and he offered nothing to suppress nationalists except to fight for Mother Russia. Still, most people were not radicalized. They were attracted to a moderate socialist platform, not the international communism of the Bolsheviks. Now, by the summer of 1917, the government was already in crisis, facing coups on all sides. In June, the First Congress of the Soviets met and immediately backed massive anti-war demonstrations. The Bolsheviks called for the overthrow of the government, which responded with repression. Trotsky was arrested, and Lenin went into hiding. In August, the conservative general Kornilov turned against the government with an army. Kerensky reversed himself, appealing to radical leaders such as Lenin to defend the February Revolution against Kornilov. Now, to do so, he gave them arms. The Bolsheviks and their allies did a good job, amassing 25,000 followers to defend the city and convincing Kornilov's troops to join them. The coup was suppressed, and the Kerensky government was saved. But in arming the radicals, legitimizing the Bolsheviks, and turning a law and order over to them, Kerensky had made a devil's bargain, and the country was ripe for a real revolution. On the 10th of October, Lenin urged the Bolsheviks to seize power. Trotsky formed a military revolutionary committee to make plans. On the morning of the 25th to 26th of October, or November by the Western calendar, 1917, Bolshevik forces occupied strategic points in Petrograd. At 9:00 p.m., the cruiser Aurora fired on a meeting of provisional government at the Winter Palace. The palace was stormed, and the members of the provisional government were arrested. On the 26th of October, or the 6th of November, the All-Russian Congress of Soviets handed over power to the Soviet Council of People's Commissars, with Lenin as chairman. Now, Russia immediately was declared a Soviet republic. At first, the new state was a true multi-party system, with representatives from the Bolsheviks, the Mensheviks, and the Revolutionary Socialists. But by the end of the year, Lenin and the Bolsheviks, increasingly called communists, urged or used the excuse that the revolution was threatened by counter-revolutionaries to begin to seize control. Freedom of the press was curtailed, the liberal cadets were outlawed, Mensheviks and socialist revolutionaries were purged from the government. Lenin established the Extraordinary Commission for Combating Counter-Revolution, Speculation, and Sabotage, also known as Cheka, which was a secret police to root out enemies of the revolution. Cheka would be the parent of the later NKVD and KGB. Now, the Russian army, or Russian royal family, was executed in Siberia in 1918. Now, from early 1918, Lenin and his followers consolidated their power and pursued their main goals: the seizure of land by peasants, the seizure of the factories by the workers, an immediate peace, and the exportation of international communism. The results of these policies, collectively known as Lenin's war communism, were disastrous. Land reform, or collectivization, led to peasant revolt and starvation, as the old food distribution system was disrupted. Workers put in charge of the factories lacked appropriate experience, and the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, finalized in March of 1918, forced Russia to cede Poland and much of Western territory, containing 1/4 of its European territory, 1/3 of its heavy industry, and 1/2 of its coal and iron. Now, Russia's former allies, Britain, France, and the United States, afraid of revolution, blockaded Russia, exacerbating the food crisis, and sent troops to support counter-revolution. The communist regime responded by organizing the Red Army and launching the Red Terror, by which thousands of opposition figures were executed. The Russian Revolution had tremendous long-term significance for European history. Its immediate impact was to free German forces on the Eastern Front for one final battle in the West.